Okay, so I'm going to ask Chuck Dowding, Elmer Lewis's colleague, to introduce Elmer.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce Elmer, who's a fellow emeritus professor at Northwestern University and former chairman of the Northwestern Department of Mechanical Engineering. In descending order of importance of his career, he met his wife, Ann, and received his BS, MS, and PhD at the University of Illinois. All occurred on campus there, including meeting his wife. The following 4 years he spent on the East Coast with the Army, where he served as a captain. And then he went to MIT as the Ford Foundation Assistant Professor of Nuclear Engineering, and then came to Northwestern in 1968 and has been there his entire career. He served as visiting professor at the University of Stuttgart and has been a consultant at Argonne, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and a number of other industrial firms. His research is focused on physics and safety of nuclear systems and on the technological risks of society more generally. He's written a book, How Safe is Safe Enough? Technological Risks, Real and Perceived. He was cast into the limelight of nuclear issues at the time of the Fukushima disaster. He appeared on half a dozen TV channels and did a number of radio and print media interviews. He's spent the pandemic bringing himself up to speed on renewable energy and has given a 3-hour Zoom mini course, Fighting Climate Change with Sun, Wind, Water, and Nuclear Energy, co-sponsored by the Evanston Public Library and Northwestern Emeritus Organization.
Thank you. I should say a little bit about Chuck and how I got involved in this. Is Chuck came up to me and he had watched this 3-hour mini course that I gave, and he said, we have a group at our church. I think it would be an interesting talk. And he said, why don't you tell them what you did in the 3 hours of your mini course, only do it in 40 minutes. So that was my attempt that I think most of you, hope maybe even all of you, saw this past few days that was posted. So what I thought I'd do this morning is to digress for a second. I wish I could have been there in person, but my wife is very immunodepressed, just got out of the hospital Friday night, and I didn't want to chance it. I would have been speaking with a mask, which would have made me a bit difficult to understand. So I think this probably was the better route to go. At any rate.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I should have mentioned too, we did have the 1 hour interview with Elmer that was published. So there may be reference to that. If you didn't get a chance to see it, that's okay. Maybe after participating today, you can go back and take a look at it on our church's YouTube channel. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what I thought I'd begin with, I like to spend most of the time in discussion and questions, was a very, very brief summary of what I had to say in the 45 minutes or an hour, to sort of highlight a couple of things and maybe raise a couple of topics for discussion along the way. Okay, this just shows the various sources of carbon-free energy, mainly solar and wind up in the upper corner, hydroelectric on the right, and a nuclear power station down below on the left. And so those are mainly what we have to consider in getting our electric system to where we're no longer burning a lot of fossil fuels. They differ a little bit in nature, and mainly from what I judged in talking to Chuck and so on, is you're very interested in the renewable energy. All of these except nuclear, of course, are renewable. Hydroelectric is a great source of electricity. The problem is, in this country and in most of the world, all the good sites for large dams are already taken, or there are ecological reasons why they shouldn't be used. So it really looks as if the choices are some combination of solar, wind, and nuclear energy. And I'll sort of be talking about that and taking questions on that today. Here you can see an important criteria of how much carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour is put into the atmosphere from these various sources. You can see that hydro, nuclear, wind, and solar put hardly any in. You might think they shouldn't put any in at all, but however, you use a lot of concrete and steel in building them, and fossil fuels are used in creating the steel. So that's where natural gas only puts in about half as much carbon dioxide as coal, which shows up here. And in fact, a lot of the gains that have been made in the US in the previous decades have been because of the switch from coal to natural gas. There's one very large caveat, and that is the problem of leaking methane directly into the atmosphere, and we can return to that later, though. So what are the challenges? They're a bit different. For renewable, there are two characteristics. One is that they're dilute. They take a lot of land, particularly solar and even more so wind. Whereas a nuclear reactor takes about a square mile, the same amount of power coming from a wind farm takes about the total area of the city of Chicago of a wind, of windmills spaced as closest together as you can put them. Nuclear, what people have been most concerned about are accidents and waste, and we can come back and talk about those. We can't cover all these topics in any detail, so I'll sort of leave it to the questioners as to what directions we go. The one point I do want to make is that electricity cannot be stored, at least in very small amounts on the scales we're talking about in batteries and so on, but they're insignificant compared to the amount that we produce. This is a demand curve for electricity for 1 week. And in terms of the peak demand for the entire year, which is the peak in the middle, you can see there, for 3 different seasons. The highest one is in the summer. The lowest one is in the spring. The fall is fairly close to that, and the intermediate one is in winter. And you notice this is for 1 week, and there are peaks each day about 4 in the afternoon. So you can see there are 7 peaks with a smaller one on Sunday when not everyone is working. And then valleys at night that are 40 or 50% of the peak. So that's what the electric system has to meet on a second by second, minute by minute basis, every day, every night, because we can't really store significant amounts of electricity at present. Okay, so the difficulty is then that renewable energies, particularly wind and solar, don't produce the energy always when we need it. And I'm trying to sum up a lot with a few slides here, but this is an example. You can see the blue curve is similar to the one that we had up before. It's for 1 week, and it had 7 peaks and valleys in it. The black curve is for wind generation when it's 50% of the power produced by wind. And this comes from Denmark, where they've about reached that point. Okay, the problem is these curves don't line up. The distance between the 2 curves has to come from someplace else. Backup energy. Natural gas is the most frequently used one. But if we want to get away from fossil fuels, it will have to be nuclear or something else. And there are problems here. You can see there are points when the wind is producing nothing. I wonder if my pointer would show up. I don't know if you can see that on the slide.
Yeah.
You can, good. Okay, for example, at this point, backup energy has to support the entire load. Up here, you're producing more wind energy than you can use, and so you have to shut down some of the windmills, and you can see it goes back and forth. And that's not even the worst of it, because the drops and climbs are very rapid, much more rapid than most power producing machinery can handle. Neither nuclear reactors nor fossil fuel plants can tend to ramp up and down that sharply. So that creates Another problem is there'll be times that can last days on end where there'll be no wind at all. And therefore, you have to have something else to fill in the entire electric load. Polar vortices are probably the most recent cause of that. Some of you may remember the Great Texas Freeze, where basically wind was missing in action. There basically was no wind during the heart of that. Okay. And so those are the problems. There'll be times when you have to produce all your energy by something other than wind. And when there is wind, your other plants have to go up and down very rapidly, which is very uneconomic. We can go into that more. Okay, so that's wind. Solar energy is more predictable. This is a curve of power over a 24-hour cycle. This particular one comes from a temperate zone in Belgium. And you can see that the solar power, it starts out at sunrise, peaks around noon, and the jiggles are because of clouds passing by. So you get that, and then it goes down to zero at sunset. So once again, the curves don't line up. We have to have backup power to get through the night to where this peak is. And very soon, if you're producing much of your energy with solar, you're producing too much at noon. So you have to cut out the solar panels. Okay. That's in the summer. In the winter, this is a typical winter day, which is fairly cloudy there. And you can see the sun comes up much later and goes down much earlier, and it's not as bright. So even if you have enough solar to power your system in the summer, you need backup power from something else in the winter. Okay, the solution that's sometimes proposed to this is storing the electricity and using it when you need it. And I would argue that that's not only not possible, that I can't even see it happening in the foreseeable future. The technical problems are so difficult in doing it. But let's move on from there. So here's what the amount of carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere is once more when we take into account that if you're using solar or wind energy, you have to have backup power. And in this, it's assumed it's natural gas, which is a fossil fuel. So you can see when you add the backup power to either solar or wind energy, you're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's still an improvement, but not much as so. If you could use nuclear for that backup power, then of course you wouldn't be putting any into the atmosphere. And it's worse than that because the gray part is what happens with the leakage of methane into the atmosphere, both in the drilling for methane and its transportation and burning it, so on, because the unburned methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in creating global warming. And so this really points out that it really is important that we cut back on the methane leakage that we're getting to go with the natural gas, because you can see with the methane leakage taken into account, methane is almost as bad as coal in the amount of carbon dioxide put in. Okay, so we talked a little bit about intermediate dilute, and there are, of course, economics to take in. Now, the cost of both solar and wind energy are coming down drastically. The problem is those costs are only the direct cost of building and operating the plants. They don't take into the account the backup energy that you need to fill in those gaps between supply and demand. And here is another bar chart where the orange part now are these indirect costs for the getting the power on the grid. That all of them have a little bit of that. That's mainly for transmission lines to get it hooked up to the grid. But you can see in the case of wind and solar, once again, it's the cost of running the gas plants or whatever, nuclear plants, or even if we come up with a method of storing electricity somehow, there's going to be a cost associated with that, and we don't know what that is yet. Okay. So the last thing is we can talk about energy storage options. And here are some of the things that are talked about, but I think probably I ought to keep quiet and try to answer some questions or find out what you all are interested in. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey to moderate this whole thing and pick the questioners and so on that way.
Thanks, Elmer. I have been so enlightened by your presentation and the interview and today. It's just not as simple, is it, as let's just go to wind and solar, then everything will be perfect. You are putting your finger on some of the key issues involved that make this more nuanced and more challenging. I have a simple question to get us started. Going to the bottom line, which is where we ended our recorded interview, can you name one or two public policy proposals or changes, specific public policy proposals or changes that arise from your research?
Well, I think the main thing is how much you want to put in the way of subsidies for these various alternatives. I think if you're putting the majority or most of it into the renewable energies, it's almost a fool's errand. And unless you can figure out how you're going to take out into account those gaps between supply and demand when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. I'm sorry, my background is in nuclear, so I tend to be an advocate for that, but I think for good reason. I think that there are countries who have gone that direction. France, for example, produces 3/4 of its electricity with a fleet of reactors. They've got the lowest carbon footprint of any country in Europe, and they also have some of the lowest electricity rates. But yet, because of people's fear of accidents and waste and so on, other countries like Germany are going in the opposite direction, and they are not able to reduce their carbon dioxide input because they're still burning a lot of coal and actually shutting down their reactors. So I don't know, there's a long answer to a short question.
Let me ask it again. I'm going to hold your feet to the fire here.
Sure.
What's one, if you were the president or a Congress, what's one thing you would do to implement what's suggested by your research?
Oh dear, that is a tough one. I think they are doing this, and I think the Biden administration is doing a fairly good job of trying to speed up demonstration projects. Part of the problem with the nuclear is the inability to build reactors rapidly and on budget. We've done a much poorer job of this than other countries. In France, they have been building at about half the cost of here. In Korea, even less. But this gets into social philosophy. Those tend to be somewhat more, shall I say, socialistic countries where the electric grid is run by one big quasi-governmental organization. So there's a lot of coordination there. In this country, it's much more of a private enterprise thing that's split up into pieces, and there's a lot lost. I think the government policies that can get more coordination over this, so that, for example, we could decide on a single set of reactor designs and produce many of them rather than each company having its own design and driving up the cost. So I think there are government policies that can bring down the cost. On the renewable energy, I'm not sure what the government can do to make that more efficient, or to get they are putting a lot of money into trying to come up with methods of storage, but those are very long-term research projects, and we really don't have the time to deal with that. If you look at the time that it takes to, for example, to bring reactors up to speed or solar panels, it's usually a couple of decades to work out all the bugs and really make the things work efficiently. So it's a dilemma.
Well, Elmer, I watched the program last night, and you very clearly outlined the concerns about accidents, nuclear accidents, and really clearly for me, really reflected in your presentation that it really is not the danger that we expected, we think it is, because of all of the, all of the discussion about it. So wouldn't it be helpful to have public policy to really present the kind of information that you presented in that program to really relieve people's concern about nuclear energy?
Yes, it would, but I think it's very difficult. I found this is in dealing with the aftermath of the Fukushima situation, for example, because one of the things is I have friends in the journalism school, so I have to be very careful here. But is that the journalists they have good intentions and they do a very good job at some things, but it's really difficult because to take an example with the renewable energy, they will quote people which statements that are true, but are not what they seem. And again, it's technical. I have to get in. You hear about somebody putting up a gigawatt of a gigawatt wind farm and comparing that to a reactor that produces a gigawatt power. The problem is it's a gigawatt of capacity. That's how much power it can produce when the wind is more than 20 miles an hour. But if you average that over a year, it's only about a third of that. With solar energy, it's worse. It's when they say a gigawatt solar farm, that's how much it can produce on a sunny afternoon and the summer solstice. And it's going to be, of course, it's less than a fourth of that if you average it over the year. So you get those things that the statement is correct, but there's a lot of background to get the perspective on what it really means. It's a difficult problem. I mean, anything technical to explain to the public is a big challenge in itself. But I'm not sure that was very helpful, but.
I was just thinking, she made such great gains against, smoking with public policy, great gains, I think, early on with getting kids vaccinated against polio, many different things. So it seems to me that we ought to be able to do this from the level of from the governmental level. And I think the journalists, I'm married to a journalist. And I know that journalists are really interested in the truth. Many journalists are very interested in the truth, I should say. Not everyone, but many journalists. So I think with the exerted effort, and with the support of the scientists, we really, like you, and engineers and so on and so forth, I think that we could really make that happen.
Well, there are pushes to get my colleagues and me out to talk to groups like this to sort of make the case and point out some of the difficulties that arise. And it's a very controversial area because there are a lot of players who've got money and effort invested in fossil fuels. Certainly, you have to deal with. If these changes are made, it's going to make a lot of difference in people's lives. We have friends in Houston who they're worried sick about what happens to the economy of the oil producing parts of the country if this because it does bring about broad social changes that are there'll be winners and losers in that, and it makes it very difficult to deal with.
Good morning. Elmer, in one of your slides, you showed the gap between the demand for energy and what solar or wind could produce. I thought you implied that nuclear might be a solution to filling that gap. As I understand it, though, nuclear tends to be more of a base load generation source.
That's the economic, yeah, you're putting your finger on a very important point that's hard to explain. The problem is, if for any plant that's capital intensive, and particularly nuclear, the fuel cost is practically nothing. The cost is building the plant. Well, to recover that capital, you need to run the thing 24/7 at full power, because you make money by doing that. And nuclear plants can do that. They can run like 95% of the time. The only time they have to shut down is once every couple of years for about a month to refuel part of them. Where was I on that? So
It really doesn't.
Economics. If you have to run those plants by going up and down, the power reactors, they can follow that more gentle curve on the demand thing. They do it in France. It's called load following. But to shut completely down and start up very rapidly, it's almost, well, we know how to do it, and we can build reactors to do it, and they're in submarines and aircraft carriers because they have to do that. But they're much more expensive. They're a totally different design, and they'd be very uneconomical for producing, electric power. So yeah, you can do it. The same thing is true, incidentally, of natural gas plants, because the so-called dual cycle ones that are most efficient, their economics again goes to pot if you have to run. In fact, most places they aren't allowed to run at less than half power, because the combustion is bad. You get more air, you get not only more carbon dioxide, but you get more air pollution and think smog if you run these at partial power. So yeah, the fact that the backup power has to keep going up and down, it's like anything, your car is much more efficient at 70 miles an hour on an expressway than it is in stop and start driving. And that's what you're asking these backup power plants to do, is keep shutting down, starting up, shutting down, and so on that way.
Forgive me, Jeffrey, if I just follow on question to that would be, would one way of filling the gap in any region because of the lack of sunlight or the lack of wind be expanding the power grid so that you could connect into places where the wind or solar energy were available?
That's one of the methods that is proposed, and you can get some value of averaging, like that one curve I showed you with all the ups and downs during cloud cover. Well, you can average over several wind farms that are miles apart, and that would all average out. The same thing. If the phenomena is localized, yeah, you can, if you've got the transmission capability, you can bring it in from other places. But if you have a polar vortex or something that's covering a large area, as happened in Texas and one happened in Minnesota and the Dakotas a few years ago. And in that case, yeah, they had enough transmission line capability to bring in nuclear power from Illinois and other places. But what often happens is you wind up starting old coal plants that you'd shut down thinking you wouldn't need anymore. And suddenly in your thing, you've got to get some more power from someplace. And that's typically been the primary place where they've gone. So.
Yes, thank you. I've been fascinated by your talk, and I thank you very much for it. And I can tell that you really are pushing nuclear, and I think that makes some sense. I wonder, though, about two other things that have come up frequently, and one of them is hydrogen power, and the other is biodegradables. And some of the fossil fuel companies are advertising that they're working with algae and seaweed and so forth. And I wonder if you have any comment on either of those.
I really don't know much of anything about the biodegradable. I think it's a possibility. I don't know whether it's only capable of playing a bit role or something larger than that. So I think I'm going to have to claim ignorance on that piece of it. Well, what was the first part of your question before you said?
Hydrogen.
Oh, hydrogen. Yeah, hydrogen has some prospects. In fact, I even, if you're interested, have a slide on that. The, the question is, how do you want to use it? Now, it's being proposed that you, well, there are several things that you take the excess, for example, solar energy from the noontime thing when you're producing too much of it, and use electrolysis to produce hydrogen. And then you can save that and burn the hydrogen at a later date to produce electricity. There are a couple of challenges with that. There's one thing, it's called the round trip efficiency. In other words, you put in a megawatt hour of hydrogen from a solar plant and you put it through electrolysis. Well, you only get about this 80% of the energy there after you've converted to hydrogen. Now, if you burn the hydrogen to produce electricity, there's something called the second law of thermodynamics that comes in, and it says you can only get, under the very best of circumstances, about, if you do it in fuel cells, they're very efficient, about 80% efficient. So now you take, 0.8 times 0.8. So now you've lost about a third of the energy. So it's the so-called round trip efficiency. Whenever you do these things, you lose. Pump storage is another method of storing electricity, if you like. And in that case, the round trip efficiency, it's about 80% there. So you're always losing some of the energy in the process. But but those are possibilities. The hydrogen situation is probably a bit worse than that because you also have to transport it and store it. And the question is, do you have enough capacity to store that hydrogen in the transmission lines? There's talk about whether you can convert natural gas lines to hydrogen and so on. So it gets buried in details after a while. I don't know if that helps or not. I've got a slide.
Let me clarify Junior's question. Junior, are you asking more about hydrogen powered vehicles rather than hydrogen powered vehicle systems?
I was just interested in his topic of just hydrogen in general, including vehicles. Yes.
Yeah, I think that it's more, it gets into the economics. I think that electric batteries have had enough of a start that if we're going to see electrification of vehicles, it will probably be by storing it in batteries and using it that way. The hydrogen could be used in fuel cells to power vehicles. And it looks like if we, for example, not for individual cars with the whole problem of frequent refueling, but if we were to electrify the railroads and some long haul trucking, then fuel cells would make more sense because of their properties. And in that case, you would use the hydrogen. So that, yeah, I think there are some good uses. Also, there's a lot of use of hydrogen directly in industry for making fertilizers, pneumonia, other industrial products that now make the hydrogen from natural gas. I mean, that's the feedstock that they use to make hydrogen. So if you could produce that from renewables or nuclear, there are actually pilot plants right now where they're producing hydrogen on site of nuclear plants in small amounts, mainly for internal use, but that could be expanded too. So yeah, there are some uses for hydrogen. I'm not sure that how big a chunk of the total need that would be, though.
Elmer, what is the prospect of the so-called possible newer generation of small. Elmer, what is the prospect of the so-called possible newer generation of smaller modular nuclear reactors? Are they possible? Would they be safer and easier to sell to the public?
There are really two categories there. One is the one, there's a company called NuScale that's producing these that are very similar in design to the pressurized water reactors that most of the world uses now. And the big argument there is that you can mass produce those components in factories rather than on site, as traditionally has been done, and really cut down the capital cost and make them much more economical. So that's one type of modular reactors. There are others that are more advanced reactors, sodium gas cooled and so on that way, that have two advantages. One, you may be able to make use of mass production, but more so, they produce, I think I'm changing the subject slightly here, but they produce energy, heat at a much higher temperature than water reactors. That heat is actually usable for things like making steel and concrete, where the water reactors, the temperatures aren't high enough. If you could do that, if we go back and look at where our greenhouse gases are coming from, about a quarter of them are from these non-electrical industrial processes where you're just smelting iron or make concrete kilns. Those type of reactors produce heat at a high enough temperature that you could replace the fossil fuels with that in there. But I've sort of taken the question off on a tangent, I'm afraid. Does that help at all? But yeah, I think we need to do both, because with the trade-off is with the modular reactors, you get the benefit of mass production of the components to drive down the cost, but there's also an economy of scale. Instead of building one big reactor, if you can build, building two middle-sized reactors, you can build one big one, you usually get more megawatts for the same amount of money. So there are these two things, and it has a lot to do with industrial organization and how it develops in a particular country. And there is a lot of interest in modular reactors. In fact, in places like in the Czech Republic and so on, they're looking where they don't need large amounts right off the bat, but where they can build in with these smaller reactors. So.
I have what I think is a simple question. What is the lifespan of a wind turbine?
Of a wind turbine? The design life for what they're designed for is about 25 years.
Then what happens to them? Are they just there forever on the horizon?
No, they have to be dismantled. And right now, well, there's some ideas for how to recycle the blades. Are very difficult to recycle because of the composite materials they're made out of. It's yeah, don't get me. My brother-in-law is giving me a bad time. He lives they have a nice rural home in central Illinois, and there's a wind farm going up around them. And a lot of the neighbors are furious. In fact, the beautiful little knoll in which my wife's parents are buried, overlooks farmlands. And the last time we went down there, it was windmills in all directions. So there's a lot of talk now about visual pollution and that stems from the dilute nature that you have to occupy so much land to get a reasonable amount of power out of them.
Yeah, and once, say a farmer sells his 1,000 acres or whatever, or rents it to a wind turbine company, when that's after 25 years, don't you have to put something under the ground to get the power to other places? So is that land usable again for farming afterward, or no?
I think it should be. Yeah, I don't think that's the problem. It's the cost of taking them down and, getting rid of it, making use of the land for something
And
else.
my understanding is the company that put it up isn't going to take it down, which then I don't know how they ever come down.
Well, that's a very difficult thing because my brother-in-law, in fact, they were made an offer to put a windmill on their land. They didn't want it, but you have to be very careful. It's sort of interesting to selling mineral rights for oil or natural gas. We have a friend who is in the oil industry, and he says you have to be very that it's in the contract that the people have to clean up their mess when they're through with the whole thing. Otherwise, you're stuck with it if it isn't, legally set up that they have to remove everything, get rid of the, temporary roads and everything that they put in at the end. It can be a problem. So, but
Sorry. A similar question would be the batteries for these electric cars. What's the lifespan of that? My understanding is that it's easier to recycle parts of a normal car or a normal battery, but the ones from electric cars have some difficulty.
I'm not familiar with the details of that. I know there are challenges. I know there are attempts to recycling. One of the questions that comes up is with the lithium ion batteries, there's a limited amount of lithium and most of it is in China. So if we're really converting over to electric cars, there may be some materials access problems and that'll be reflected in the cost, but it's not something I've followed in detail. So I'm going to have to beg off on that one.
Thank you.
Illinois used to have more nuclear plants than they do now. Is there anything we can do to make it possible?
Actually, they haven't. Okay, the only ones I know of that were shut down was Dresden 1, which was sort of a prototype for more modern ones, and the Zion plant, for which there were political as well as technical difficulties. But we've got 11 reactors operating in Illinois, and more than half of the electricity for I think the entire state, certainly for Northern Illinois, comes from nuclear power now. It was a bit higher than that, except a lot of the recent expansion has been in natural gas and other things. So there was fear of shutting them down because of this problem of their being used as backup power for particularly wind farms that were going up in Iowa and Wisconsin and so on. And they'd connect into this gets into the third of the details again, but because the state laws were written to subsidize the renewable energies, they could connect into the same power lines that were built to carry the electricity from, say, northwestern Illinois into Chicago. There's the Byron plants up there. And the renewables got priority legally. So that meant that those transmission lines could only carry so much electricity, so that when the wind farms plugged into them, the reactors had to cut back in the amount of electricity they could part. And so with that, they became uneconomical. So you probably heard about the state finally passed a law to, quote, subsidize the nuclear industry. That's because they're caught in this bind. If they have to be shutting down their plants periodically because the wind and the solar gets priority, it really messes up the economics of how you run them, because the fuel doesn't cost much, but they do have staffs and other things that have to be paid whether they're running or not. So
is fusion a total pipe dream?
Well, the joke in the technical community is that 50 years ago, they said it was 20 years off. Now they're saying it's 20 years off. But there has been some recent progress made on it. And I haven't followed it fairly closely because I sort of tuned out a couple of decades ago. But the difficulty is they aren't yet at the point where Enrico Fermi was in 1942 under Stagg Field when he got the first reactor to actually, work. And there are huge engineering problems with it. The size of it, the volumes that have to be under high vacuum. They say there's no radioactivity. Well, the fusion reaction that runs at the lowest temperature, so that's the first one, puts off 14 million electron volt neutrons that tend to destroy. It activates and has materials properties. So the question is, how long are those materials going to last if you have to rebuild the plant every year? So I think there are severe economic problems, even if they do get the reaction working. I've always said I don't see it in my lifetime. My lifetime expectancy isn't very long now, but I think anybody in your congregation, we probably won't see it in their lifetime. So I don't have high hope. I think we need to continue working on it because eventually they'll get something. But I think we'll probably even figure out a way to store electricity maybe before we get fusion to work. I think those are two really big problems that are outstanding. So
I've really enjoyed your talk and all the information you've given us. It's been superior. I have a question. I thought I've read somewhere that France has breeder reactors so that their nuclear rods can be reactivated in some way or reused. Whereas in the United States, when our nuclear rods in the nuclear reactors are spent, they are sent to underground locations like out in the Western Mountains. Is that true? And could you explain
a good topic. A topic close to my heart because a lot of my research has been involved with breeder reactors. Yeah, these are reactors. You have to get into the nuclear physics a little bit. The reactors that we have now, they burn uranium and they produce some plutonium. And within the same reactor, the plutonium could be burnt as well. The trouble is, well, not the trouble is, but with the present ones, you're burning the uranium faster than you're producing the plutonium. With a breeder reactor, because of the totally different design of the things, they're actually set up so that you're creating more plutonium that then can be used as fuel than you're burning uranium. And this is important because the fissionable uranium is uranium-235, which is only 0.7% of all uranium. The rest is uranium-238. So a breeder reactor creates plutonium from burning the 235, which then can be burned later. It can be recycled from the fuel. So it's a complicated, series of nuclear reactions that have to go on. But yeah, it can be done, and it has been done. But they've only been in prototype plants because there's no economic. Uranium is so cheap that it's cheaper to mine more uranium, enrich it, and use that rather than recycling the plutonium. But if the price of uranium ever goes up high enough because the resources are depleted, then there's this backup. You can go to breeder reactors. And there used to be a lot of emphasis on them when we didn't think there was that much uranium, but people kept finding high-grade uranium ores all over the world. There's much more uranium than there is fossil fuel, for example. And so, the time when we actually need to do that keeps being put off further and further into the future.
Elmer, do you have an estimate of the volume of waste that would be generated to be commensurate with, say, the electricity someone used in a lifetime, just to get the volume of how much waste is produced per human consumption of electricity over their lifetime? I'm just trying to get a volume here because I'm wondering how big that is.
I have to get, this sort of gets into the problem of nuclear so-called waste, which we call spent fuel, which is the fuel that comes out of a reactor. Yeah, the French are doing this. They reprocess this waste, and it turns out that of that spent fuel, only about 10 or 15% of it is the actual fission products that have all this radioactivity in it. Okay, and what their thing of, they separate these out, and then they implant these fission products that are so radioactive in these ceramic logs, which they can eventually do away with. Okay, to get back to your question, so for each person, for each year that they're using nuclear power, their piece of this ceramic log with the radioactive material into it is 1 cubic centimeter. So it's about that big. So that's how much radioactive material you get out of a thing per year.
Can you compare the number of radiation deaths for type, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island? Because I think you had earlier on in your longer discussion, you touched upon the subject. I think it's interesting to know how many or how few or what actually happened with these 3 incidents.
Okay. 3 Mile Island, none. For Chernobyl, there were about 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer, resulting in about less than 20 deaths. If you've got to have cancer, have thyroid cancer. My wife had it because the cure rate is very high if it's caught. More importantly, if in the old Soviet Union they'd had any public health at all, they would have just told people, don't drink the milk from the cows living next to the reactors for the first several months or couple of years afterwards, because it was only because of the radiation that was concentrated in the thyroid gland through cow's milk that they got these doses. The other stuff, the World Health Organization have tried, and the number of cancers that were caused were imperceptible. In contrast, people were scared out of their wits, and it's estimated there were 1,000 or more suicides that results from people's depression and so on, thinking they'd been radiated and they were going to die, and many more abortions than that, because people falsely thought that the amount of radiations that they were exposed to was caused them going to have a deformed child or something like that. Okay, with the Fukushima accident, no one died from the radiation. There were 3 workers who died in the plants. 2 of them drowned, and then the 3rd one was hit by a falling beam. And studies were shown there were only about a dozen or so people who received as much or more radiation than you would receive in a whole body CAT scan. So that's kind of the levels we're talking about. And but once again, the problem was, I'm tempted to go back, as I said the other night, to FDR, and the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Because of the fear, they evacuated hospitals, nursing homes, and they're estimating that over 1,000 people died as a result of those unnecessary evacuations. Because people's pharmaceutical regimes were interrupted. They didn't have proper places to put them. They were just all sorts of things, depression and other things that set in. So the real danger is we've scared people so badly about these things that when something does happen, their reactions to it are causing many more deaths than the actual accident itself. So.
I have a question. We're talking about large scale energy production and so on. In a single family home, is it possible to store enough energy from solar to run that home? have the capacity to do that?
I guess the honest answer is I don't know, but I think it's probably possible if you've got enough room for batteries in your basement and if you've got enough solar paneling. But I don't know. You'd have to actually figure out the square footage of solar pan. But I kind of doubt it because this problem of having much less energy coming in the winter than in the summer, you have to store stuff for so long, and the longer you have to store it, the more capacity you have to have. So my guess would be no, but I wouldn't want to be in an out and out debate about it because I don't have the numbers at the tip of my fingers.
Thank you.
So the reason Elmer was with us today and for the interview is to help us get our minds around the big question, which is how do we slow down global warming? The way to do that is to move to renewables. Beyond that, it becomes complex. Elmer has helped us understand the complexity. Thinking Christians and people of faith need to understand the complexity and be willing to engage it. And Elmer, you've given us exactly the right framework and language and facts to engage that complexity. I really thank you for your contribution to our Faith and Environment series.
No, thank you. You're more than welcome. I enjoy doing it.